afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Recognizing and Preventing Hazing. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center for Security on Campus, and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. I'm first going to start by just going through some housekeeping items before we get started. If you look at your control panel, you'll notice that we have a section for you to type in questions, your thoughts. We are going to have some areas or some times throughout this webinar in which we're going to be looking for your feedback, your experiences. So we hope that you are going to use that questions pane to interact with your questions and comments when we come to that time. We'll also have times throughout the webinar where you can certainly ask questions, and we'll have some time at the end for anything that's lingering. We are going to record today's webinar, and it will be provided to you in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email. If you haven't had the chance to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking on the link in the control panel. So as we go through, my colleague Amy, we're going to mention a lot of different resources. We're going to talk about a number of different types of information. So when that happens, you can go into the control panel and you'll see links as to where you can access some of the resources that we're referencing. There's also a handouts pane that you should see within your control panel. Many of you received the handouts prior to this webinar if you were signed up before yesterday. However, if you did not have the opportunity to do that, you can click on the handout section and download both the slides for this webinar as well as a companion resource that we're going to be talking about as we go throughout the webinar. This year's Know More and Do More campaign connects colleges and universities with information and resources at no cost to them. So any individual that signs up for the campaign has access to a number of different resources that we've divided into Know More resources, which help increase our knowledge in specific campus safety areas, and then Do More resources. So those resources turn that knowledge into action through policy evaluation, programs, and we're going to be talking about some of those resources in particular during today's webinar. Before we get started, we just wanted to get a sense of who's in the room and what some of their past experiences are. So we're going to ask you to answer a poll that will launch in just a moment. And what we'd like you to do is just give us a sense of whether or not you've participated in National Campus Safety Awareness Month before. So you can select one of the answers. Yes, you've done it in partnership with the Clery Center. You've engaged in one of our campaigns in the past. Yes, your institution only. Yes, through social media only, or no, you've never been involved in National Campus Safety Awareness Month before today. So we're going to take some time for the poll. It looks like many of you have done something in relation to National Campus Safety Awareness Month, although many of you have mentioned that they've been campaign or institution-run initiatives. So we'll give that about 10 more seconds to wrap up, and then we'll share those results with all of you. So we noticed a lot of you, many of you have done National Campus Safety Awareness Month through your institution, but many of you have never participated in National Campus Safety Awareness Month before. So that's really wonderful to consider that many of you are looking for new resources, you're engaging in new ways, and hopefully this webinar is just going to be one other way to communicate and connect with some of those resources and people as well. Just to give you a sense of the flow of today's webinar, we're going to start with our panelist discussion and leave time at the end of the discussion for questions and answers. Again, please feel free to use the questions pane to share questions and comments throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as possible during our time together. Before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about the panelists that have joined us here today. Dr. Elizabeth Allen is Professor of Higher Education at the University of Maine and President of Stop Hazing. She was the principal investigator for the National Study of Student Hazing and currently serves as director for the Hazing Prevention Consortium, a research-to-practice initiative focused on contributing to an evidence base for hazing prevention. Elizabeth Shaler currently serves as an assistant director in the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Affairs at Lehigh University, where she coordinates the local hazing coalition as well as hazing education and prevention efforts. Previously, she worked at Harvard College, where she spent 3 years working in the Office of Housing and Residential Programs. Elizabeth has spent time at Pace University and Vanderbilt University, where she received her master's degree in higher education administration. Elizabeth is also a member of the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors. So since we've brought you to Elizabeth's today, we'll make sure to continue to use their last names when they're talking so that you have a sense of who's talking throughout the webinar. So I want to start with you, Elizabeth Allen, and I'd like to get a sense from you, why are we talking about hazing? Why do you think that hazing in particular is an important topic to highlight right now?
Well, that's a great question, Abby. Hazing is an important issue to highlight right now for many reasons. Among the more obvious reasons is the harm to students. And students have died from hazing, and that alone should be reason enough for us to pay attention to this issue and for educators to better understand so that they can help prevent it. But in addition to severe physical harm and other types of physical harm that many of you may have heard about, cuts, bruises, burns, alcohol poisoning, physical exhaustion, there's also the less visible psychological harm that can leave lasting scars for individual students in the form of acute and chronic stress, PTSD, depression, maladaptive coping mechanisms, and so forth. But I think it's important to take into consideration also that beyond the individual harm, hazing can also damage relationships. It can harm the reputation of the groups in which it occurs, and of course cast a shadow on the reputation of the colleges and universities hosting those groups. And for those who have seen a high-profile incident unfold on a campus, you know that hazing can be a major drain on resources, both material resources and human resources. But also, I believe that a tolerance for or minimization of hazing contributes to shaping campus climates that are more likely to, where we're more likely to see other kinds of abuse. And that's because the dynamics of hazing intersect with the dynamics of other forms of interpersonal violence. So if we're truly committed to promoting healthy environments and optimizing student learning and development, then we can't ignore hazing in the process.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I think kind of resonated with me from what you just said is you talked a little bit about it shaping the climate on the campus, and I know that that's a term that we hear quite a bit right now, not just in relation to hazing, but campus sexual assault and other issues that we're seeing at colleges and universities. So Elizabeth Shaler, can you share a little bit from your lens, what is the impact of hazing on a community? Why is it so important for institutions to be taking a closer look at this topic?
Yeah, the thing about hazing and the way that it normalizes, as Elizabeth Allen said, the interpersonal violence, the standards around alcohol that culture has created, it really impacts not only the campus community but the different sub-communities, so your Greek community, your athletic community, your performing arts groups, and it creates those norms where being a bystander just becomes increasingly okay. And so you build this culture where folks are not intervening when they see something, and it's, as to Elizabeth's point again, you're just building an unhealthy community around several different issues of interpersonal violence.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I appreciate is you talked about how it addresses and it impacts multiple different groups, and that's something later on in this webinar we're going to talk a little bit about a new resource that the Clery Center has developed and working with Stop Hazing and others, and that was one of the themes that we were seeing over and over, that it's not just one particular type of student group, that it's running the gamut. So on the slide in front of you, you can take a look at just some of the many different statistics that certainly that we're seeing through research. Elizabeth Allen certainly played a key role in that research of how hazing is impacting our campus communities and looking at those groups. And when Elizabeth Allen started in talking about why hazing was important, she mentioned a couple of different types of hazing that we frequently see, but we wanted to get a sense from all of you as to what hazing looks like. So this is one of those opportunities, as I mentioned, that we're going to ask you to answer some questions that we'll throw out and pose to all of you. So if you go into that questions pane, please use that space and give me some examples using that chat function. What are some different examples of hazing? So what might that look like at a college or at a university? And we certainly know that it's not specific to college and that hazing can occur before we get into that environment. But please list some examples and I'll share them with the group. So it's interesting because a lot of different things that are being listed, many of you all at once talked about servitude. So where somebody's in a position to perform certain duties for someone else, lineups, calisthenics, making new members drive older members places so that going in line with that servitude, they have to perform certain tasks for others in the group. Scavenger hunts where only a select group participates. Sleep deprivation, forced exercise, initiation rituals that go beyond a non-threatening orientation, anything that could be embarrassing. So a lot of what I'm seeing here really is certainly running the scope in terms of different types of hazing, and those that some might argue, or the language that they might use is that they're minor in nature, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how different forms of hazing impact the overall culture and how they're not in fact minor, as well as a number of different other things that are also illegal. So some of you are mentioning things like forced drug use, certain things, financial hazing, a lot of different great examples, which certainly we'll be exploring later, and emotional abuse. So some of the things that we're going to explore throughout this webinar are what are some of the different forms that hazing can take, what might it look like. So Elizabeth Allen, I'm going to kind of turn to you to hear a little bit more about this. What does hazing look like, and how is it similar to some other forms of violence?
So those are all really great examples of what hazing can look like. And, you know, there are many more because hazing can really take many different forms depending on how a particular activity or behavior is implemented. So I think that's really key, and a particular challenge in working around this issue, because it's hard to provide students with a list of things that definitely constitute hazing. And that is typically what they are asking for. But the problem is that we tried that in the past, especially with insurance companies wanting to really get specific about what kinds of behaviors would be prohibited in a hazing policy, and certainly college campuses wrote hazing policies as well, giving specific examples. But the problem was that it led to a lot of confusion. For example, if you said that a scavenger hunt was hazing, students wouldn't understand, you know, why is a scavenger hunt hazing? I did it in my Girl Scout troop growing up, and it wasn't a problem then. It wasn't against the law. Why are you telling me it is now? And that has to do, of course, with the how the scavenger hunt is implemented and what kinds of things are being expected, who is being asked to participate, is there alcohol involved, is there requests for personal servitude involved, sexual favors, and so on and so forth. Another really vivid example of the problem of having a very, or trying to come up with a comprehensive list of hazing behaviors is that forced drinking or alcohol intoxication was commonly on that list, because as we know, that is a frequent type of hazing behavior. But so when students, it was soon after that we saw several deaths from water intoxication. So students saw the list, and students who were interviewed, you know, after the fact in these incidents said, well, we knew we couldn't force people to drink alcohol, so we decided to use water instead because it wasn't on the list, so we figured it wasn't hazing. So I think we really could make a lot of progress if we can do more to work with students and others who are close to students to talk about when something crosses the line. It's not necessarily the activity, but it's how it's implemented, and whether or not it's humiliating, degrading, somehow abusive or potentially abusive and dangerous. And that hazing can occur regardless of someone's willingness to participate. So those are some really key components of the definition of hazing, and it helps to have conversations about that and really sort of tease it out and build the skills around being able to identify when something crosses the line.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point because some of the things that were coming up in the comments is really talking about, well, what about things like, there's a beating that leads to the death of a student. That's definitely not minor. And so that's really something that I think students really don't pay attention to often or may overlook is they look at things like a scavenger hunt or they look at some of these other behaviors like drinking too much water and they shrug it off or they excuse the behavior or they don't think that it presents a threat to them or a threat to their community because they don't have the understanding of that definition of hazing that you were just talking about. So really going back to the fact that a person might be willing to participate in an activity, but what we see is that imbalance of power and we see that humiliating, degrading behavior, it's endangering to them regardless of whether they thought they wanted to participate at the time. So it's certainly kind of a nuanced conversation to have, especially if we're looking at students or even others within the campus community that really haven't considered this before or how hazing might play a role, or the fact that things like many of the ones that you all mentioned, like a scavenger hunt or a strict diet, that some of those pieces in fact are hazing. So I really appreciate a lot of the questions or a lot of the comments that are coming up about how all of these different behaviors go back to that culture, Elizabeth Allen, that you were talking about. Elizabeth Shaler, can you share a little bit more? So we heard some examples from the group. Are there other examples of hazing that you are seeing frequently in your work that, as you've been looking at prevention around hazing that you think particularly resonate with student communities?
Yeah, what we see a lot at Lehigh is certainly a lot that was mentioned around forced alcohol consumption and personal servitude. We see a lot of forced social attendance, being required to socialize with certain groups and attend a certain number of social functions a week. Certainly, being required to be at the chapter facility for certain periods of time or at strange hours. But, the thing that we talk about a lot with our students is intent versus impact in terms of analyzing what are some of the things that they're doing within their organization. And could the intent of what they're trying to accomplish be done in another way? And so helping them think through that. And also knowing that, like to your point, Abby, about, some minor behaviors that we can all agree that, being beaten and those sorts of things are outright violent hazing behaviors. But some of these, quote unquote, minor things, how is that a slippery slope and how does that open the door then to try new things and to kind of get closer to some of those more violent behaviors?
Absolutely. And I just want to share, I so appreciate some of the comments coming in kind of as you all are processing the information that's being shared, giving your kind of commentary or your thoughts about what's being said. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciate those of you talking about how maybe the labels aren't as helpful as that conversation about explaining the intent. So really going through and better understanding, well, the reason that these particular activities are hazing is the intent behind it and how it's done. There was also a comment that was made about the social psychology behind why people haze. And that notation that the idea is creating bonding and group affinity, and that's what they want to create, and can we help them find healthy ways to do that, which we're going to be talking about even further later in this webinar. So I just want to say that I appreciate those of you who are continuing to share your thoughts as we proceed, because I think you're right on track in terms of how do we move beyond identification to really changing some of the cultures that we see or changing some of the hazing that we see on campus. But let's maybe take a step back just to talk about that key piece that you all are talking about, and where do we draw the line when we see this overlap of behaviors between things that could be healthy and team building to something that's harmful and hazing. So Elizabeth Shaler, can you comment on that? If there are behaviors that could potentially be positive or negative, how do we know if the line is crossed?
It seems obvious, but if it's not something that your organization would do in broad daylight or in front of faculty members or administrators or family, then that's something to consider and that you probably shouldn't do it. If it's something that you don't feel comfortable talking about with other groups or your friends or family, then that's something to consider as well. Again, thinking about how it could play out and the impact of these different events or different behaviors. If there's any negative repercussions that you can see playing out, then take a step back and are there other healthy ways that you can achieve those goals?
What about you, Elizabeth, Alan? How do we know if the line is crossed? What are some other things that you think we should all think about?
Well, I think some other red flags are certainly if there are only certain members, particularly the rookies, the pledges, or new initiates, new members to the group, if they're the only ones who are being required or just expected to participate in a particular activity, that's a red flag, and it deserves a closer look. And especially if those activities may, as we've mentioned, have an outcome that could be humiliating, degrading, or potentially harmful, then definitely worth a pause and recheck to see is this something that we should be doing.
And Elizabeth, Alan, if you wouldn't mind, I just pulled up the definition of hazing because it's something that keeps on coming back or that we keep on going back to in terms of this conversation. Can you just unpack this definition into some of the different parts that we should pay attention to, just reiterate some of the themes that we were just hearing?
Sure. I usually like to describe the definition in terms of three components. So the first component of hazing is that it's some kind of behavior or activity expected of someone joining or participating in a group. So it's got that group context. That's the first component that makes it different from other kinds of interpersonal violence, say bullying, for example. So you've got the group context, and the second component to tease out is that it's some kind of behavior that involves humiliation, degradation. It somehow has the potential to be abusive or physically or psychologically harmful to someone. And then thirdly, as we mentioned previously, that it can be hazing regardless of whether or not a student agrees to participate. So we found quite frequently this is a sticking point for students in that they see the first two components of the definition are there. They'll acknowledge, yes, this is an activity we're expected of someone joining this group, and yes, it could be potentially harmful or at least humiliating or degrading, but third component, they say, well, we gave them a choice of whether or not to participate, so therefore they throw it all out and conclude that it probably isn't hazing, or it certainly isn't hazing. And so that's where we really need to also strengthen educational efforts. And I think it's really, again, another nuanced conversation because it gets into the issues of consent and coercion, where you have to talk about the fact that in a group context, where you have these power dynamics operating, where you have some people who already have full membership in a group and some people who are seeking membership in the group, so you have a peer pressure situation, and you really are creating a potentially coercive environment, and in that kind of environment, you won't have a true consent, and so that's why that clause is there in most hazing policies.
Right, and I think too we have another kind of layer to this because what we've been talking about so far is really looking at the definition, so what is hazing? But even when we get to the recognition, even by members of our campus community, that a certain behavior activity is hazing, there's also the idea of, well, where do you go from there? Does somebody make the choice to report? Does somebody, even if they are not directly impacted by the hazing, would they acknowledge or do something about the hazing behaviors that we're seeing? And so we know that with this, Elizabeth Schiller had referenced a little bit earlier about bystander intervention. So we know that with this, as with other forms of bystander intervention or other crimes that we might be addressing, that there are a couple of different reasons why someone may not feel as though they're empowered to do something. There may be barriers to being able to do that. So what I'd like you to do is go back to that chat function and share a little bit about what are some of the barriers that might stand in the way of somebody making the choice to report or to do something about this hazing that they're seeing. So some of the barriers I'm already seeing come in are retaliation and social cost. And an interesting one, but an important one, is family pressure. And so, to interpret that comment, that could certainly be pressure in terms of the family of the student group, looking at family in that way, or we could be talking about about a person's actual family. Maybe that family member was within the same group. It's something that has been continuing for an extended period of time within that particular student organization, and something that's expected at this point. Want to be included and belong. A lot is going back to fear and retaliation, and especially peer acceptance. And some of you are raising, well, what about if it's a norm? I know that that's one of the questions that have been coming up. How do you make a difference if this is ingrained in campus culture to the point where this is something where people expect when they become a part of this group, or there's certainly the loyalty to the organization that many folks are considering. So these are people that, regardless of what's happening, I may care about this group, I may care about the other members of this group, and I feel like once I get past this point, it's going to be better. So they just want to get through the experience and become a member so that they can belong in that way. So a lot of you had patterns related to those common themes, so whether it's retaliation, peer acceptance, and some of you even mentioned just not knowing what to do. So what's going to happen when I make that report? So that's where we want to start thinking about what might be some of those steps. If we're keeping those barriers in mind, then what can we do about hazing, or how are we going to see change on campus? So Elizabeth Schiller, I'd like to start with you. What are some of the barriers that you're seeing in the work that you're doing?
I think that you really mentioned all of them that came across in the chat. The biggest one we see is that fear of ostracization and the loss of social capital, and then to some extent, not viewing it as hazing, the consenting to the activity and not really understanding that what's happening is a hazing behavior. So that's what we see kind of on the ground the most.
And so Elizabeth Allen, if we are seeing these barriers, if this is coming up consistently for individuals on our campus, then what are we supposed to do next? Where do we go forward from there?
Well, I think it's really important to start where you are, of course, and I think we know from the research that many people still overlook hazing and minimize it. And so there are times in which hazing is occurring out in public view on campus and public campus spaces. So we need to do more to help people notice hazing, because we can't prevent it until people notice it when it happens and interpret it as a problem. So that, I would say, is a great starting point. But certainly not enough, because there we're talking about intervention and response to suspicions of hazing. And what we really want to get to is primary prevention. And so we need to look at what the institution can do to engage in some, taking a real commitment to hazing prevention, and sustaining that commitment over time in a way that's going to be meaningful. And I know we're going to talk more about specifics of that in a little bit. But I would say too, in terms of noticing, going back to the response, it's really crucial, because when you do see a red flag, it is a point in the chain of events that could be escalating. And so the more that we can help members of the campus community identify when something may be suspicious, it may or may not be hazing, but it's worth saying something. It's worth asking a question. It's worth taking a moment to say to a student, gee, you look really tired this week. Is everything okay? Or just having conversations with students about hazing. Sometimes you'll be talking with a group of students and bring up the topic of hazing and get a lot of blank stares, and a week later one of those students stops by your office and says, I was thinking about that conversation we had about hazing, and now that I've had a few days to think about it, a few things come to mind, and I'd like to talk with you about it. So I think trying to find as many opportunities as possible to have those conversations, not only with students but with colleagues with parents and family members and community members too.
I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of times, at least, when people are having conversations around hazing and bystanders, it often goes back to, well, what are students seeing? What are they doing about it? But some of what I'm hearing from you is it also goes beyond students and the role that they play, but also others on the campus that may be observing the behaviors of the faculty member that's seeing it in the classroom. What are some of the red flags that they can be looking for? Are there any other red flags, in terms of behavior, Elizabeth Allen, that you might be able to identify, or are there other ways that faculty in particular might be able to get involved if they want to better address hazing? And I know we'll talk about that more in depth with conversation about the Hazing Consortium, but what are some of those general things that a faculty member might be able to do to address hazing?
Sure. Well, I've known faculty members who stumbled upon hazing when a student fell asleep on their lab bench in a chemistry lab or something like that, or falling asleep on their desks at particular times in the semester. If they notice that a student seems to be deprived of hygiene when they haven't appeared that way in the previous weeks of the semester, those are some kinds of red flags. If they're wearing a suit to class or some different kind of attire that is unusual for them, it's worth pausing and asking a question. Sometimes you'll see students walking in a line across campus, carrying heavy backpacks, or there are any number of things that you might just look the other way and shrug it off until you learn more about hazing, and then you might say, oh, wait a minute here, I wonder what else is going on. Maybe nothing, but it's probably worth asking.
So if we're looking about, some of those individual things we can do, we can, take a look at what are some of those red flags. Elizabeth just mentioned quite a few of them. What's my role in all of this? And then, another piece is just knowing where to report. So Elizabeth Shaler, can you share a little bit on your campus? How do you let students or others on campus know how to report if they do see hazing happening or they hear of hazing happening? What's your process for making sure that the community is aware of what to do?
Sure. I mean, we target different groups at different times. So certainly when we have our Greek students going through new member education, we offer training and information to both chapter members and potential new members about what hazing could look like and what resources are available. So our new hazing prevention website, the offices on campus that they can speak with, anonymous reporting forms, anonymous phone lines, those sorts of things. We're also working to educate our faculty and staff about what are those, if you do see weird behavior or new behavior, does it coincide with one of those times where it's rookie season with athletic or new member education with the Greek students. So we take a lot of time, particularly in my office in Fraternity and Sorority Affairs, to hit people at those peak times when those behaviors might be occurring.
So as you can see on some of these examples of what to do on an individual level, some of what she was just describing is really giving the professionals the tools or the strategies to address that. So do they know what hazing is? Do they know what to look for? And if so, do they know what to do next? And so there are a couple of different layers, and some of you that are on this webinar are very familiar with hazing. Others are new to the topic and really trying to learn more, try to understand how you can be involved in educating on your campus. So even just learning more about the topic, can it be raised at a staff meeting? Is there an opportunity for professional development? Is there a way to incorporate other forms of education? Is something to think about or consider. So while we're looking at that, we can also look at more broadly, what are we seeing that's working in terms of addressing hazing, not just individually, but within the field? What are some of the patterns? What are some of the things that different institutions are doing? So Elizabeth Allen, can you tell me about some of the strategies that you're seeing? Both of you are doing a lot of work in this area. What are some of the things that you're seeing that are working in hazing prevention?
So Elizabeth Shaler and I are both involved in this project called the Hazing Prevention Consortium, and it's a group of an amazing group of individuals who are working in 8 universities who have made this serious commitment to hazing prevention. By joining the consortium, they're committing to at least a 3-year implementation of a comprehensive approach to hazing prevention. So just that's a little background about it. And so we're in our 3rd year of this first group now, and we have gained a number of insights. I will say, we're starting with core strategies that have been proven effective in other arenas, because at the present time we don't yet have an evidence base established in terms of what works for hazing prevention. So that's what we're doing. We're working in this research to practice initiative to not only implement a comprehensive hazing prevention on these 8 campuses, but also to evaluate particular strategies to generate some data about what's working and what's more or less effective. So some of the core strategies that we're implementing will probably be familiar to many of you because you've seen them play out in other arenas, such as sexual violence. So we're using bystander intervention as a core strategy for hazing prevention. We're using, of course, trainings for students, for faculty, for staff members, and the broader community. We're looking at all the campuses are doing policy and protocol reviews and ensuring that their policies are in alignment. We're also building on the social norms approach and implementing that based on assessment data. We're using visible messaging from campus leaders, as well as ethical leadership development for students, and outreach to the broader community, because with hazing, we'll often find that alumni play a role, and so it's really crucial to bring them into the conversation. And also we found through the research that students often tell friends outside of their campus and their family members about what's happening, and so getting the word out to family and friends is really important as well.
And one resource that I wanted to point out to all of you is that in the handouts drop down, you'll see a document that's labeled Emerging Strategies for Hazing Prevention. So this is pulled from another resource, and we're going to give you more detail about the longer resource a little bit later. But this document has some clear examples of what are some of these strategies and what are some examples of how that might play out on a campus. But Elizabeth, you used some terms certainly that we see quite a bit in terms of prevention work, but for folks on the webinar who may be new to some of this, I'm going to ask if you can explain a little bit more about what you meant by social norm campaigns. What would that mean, or what would that look like?
Sure. So a social norms campaign is when you make a concerted effort to really saturate the campus with information that's research-based, so and it's informed by data that you've gathered from the students on your campus around their perceptions of and their experiences with hazing. So often you'll find that based on survey data, students on campus will say they don't support hazing, and a large percentage of that of those students will say, no, this is never okay. And so getting that kind of information out to students in a poster campaign is an example of how you might use social norms messaging for hazing prevention.
Great, and that lines up with some of the comments or the questions that were coming in, with people saying, well, what about when it feels ingrained in the culture? What about when it feels like everyone supports this? Something like a social norms campaign might be able to feed into that, because it can help address the fact that most individuals on the campus are not supportive of this type of behavior. Elizabeth Shaler, you shared a little bit about the work that Lehigh is doing, but I'd be interested, can you share a little bit more about your role in terms of the consortium and what that has meant in terms of growth of programs or into some of the changes that you've seen on your campus in terms of prevention?
Sure. I started working with the consortium project at Lehigh last year when it was in year 2 of our 3-year commitment. And we really took that first year before I arrived to assess our culture and to see where we were. So we worked with Elizabeth and her team to look at what the problems were at Lehigh and what were the things that we needed to tackle and what core strategies would be best for us to focus on. So over the past year since I arrived, I've been working with our local hazing coalition, which is built up of membership across the institution, so faculty, staff, students, and other stakeholders that are committed to this issue. This is a group that fuels the hazing prevention efforts on our campus and identified what were the ways that we wanted to attack this issue and what core strategies we felt were most relevant for Lehigh. So for example, we spent this past year building a new website which provides information on hazing resources, training opportunities, introduction to what hazing prevention and awareness is, and we reviewed our hazing investigation protocols. And so, you know, that hit on some of the core strategies like communicating to a broader audience, as well as, you know, policy and protocol review. This year we're looking at launching a campus-wide anti-hazing statement that's signed by multiple different groups and endorsed by our, you know, university president, so that there's really a clear message from the institution to our students and staff that this is an issue that we take seriously and we don't condone the behavior. So I think that it's been awesome to work with Elizabeth in terms of thinking strategically about which issues we attack and which core strategies are going to work best for our students. And, you know, having the local coalition, that just having that, you know, be a constant over the past 3 years is something that certainly, even if when our relationship ends with the consortium, that's a group that will continue to be committed to the effort.
Right. And I think one of the things that you talked about is, you know, all the different types of people that are involved in this process. And I think a barrier that many have identified, or maybe I should say a challenge that people have identified, is really figuring out, you know, who should be at the table for this. How do we make sure that we're working with the right audiences, that we have the right people kind of invested in doing this work? Elizabeth Allen, can you share a little bit about who those recommended stakeholders should be from what you're seeing and some of the research so far, and what, you know, the results that you're seeing from the consortium, and some things that they should think about in bringing those parties together?
Absolutely. So just to back up a little bit, the coalition-based approach is one of the research-based principles of, you know, prevention science that you know, if you really want to make a concerted and effective prevention effort, you really need to build capacity on your campus and also proceed with a coalition-based approach that as you mentioned, Abby, there's a diverse set of stakeholders at the table. When it comes to hazing prevention stakeholder group, you're going to see some overlap with other kinds of coalitions on your campus, including folks like campus police, campus safety, the Deans of Students Office, the Fraternity Sorority Affairs, student activities, the representative from student conduct. You'll want to have representation from athletics, from performing arts groups. It's ideal to have some members of the faculty, and in particular we recommend faculty members who are engaged in scholarship that could be related in some way, maybe organizational behavior, leadership development, sociology, psychology, anthropology. There are a number of potential connections you could make there, and they can help build capacity also around the assessment and evaluation pieces. I would say too that, as I mentioned before, alumni are a key stakeholder group, and Lehigh has done a really great job of bringing all these different constituent groups to the table. including a number of their professionals from Alumni Affairs. And you can also consider members of the local community and folks in campus recreation. So we know that hazing cuts across many different kinds of student organizations. And so having staff, professional staff, and students who represent all these different kinds of organizations. So that can be fraternities and sororities, honor societies, ROTC, athletics, intramural sports, club sports, and other kinds of, you know, if there are other prestigious groups on campus that tend to have long histories and traditions, they may also have hazing traditions embedded in their organization as well, so it would be good to bring them to the table too.
Great. And one of the resources that we're going to share with you all actually has some of this list. I know many of you are probably furiously writing some of the different individuals that Elizabeth Allen just mentioned. So one of the resources that's available for free, in addition to including a lot of information about those emerging strategies, also includes that recommended list of individuals and that recommended list of stakeholders. Before we explain or share a little bit about a newer resource, Elizabeth Allen, was there anything else in terms of the scope of what hazing is, the barriers, or prevention that you would want to share with this audience before we talk about some of the different ways or resources available for them to do this?
Well, I guess I just want to emphasize that, you know, and it may be obvious, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And so it's really important to take into account the unique histories of an institution, the culture, the demographics of the students, the unique traditions, and so forth. So, you know, and that's where the assessment piece and in that, you know, early stages of the process is important. I wouldn't say that you should put everything on hold while you gather data and do an assessment. I think, you know, forge ahead with the efforts that are in place to help people to understand hazing and help to prevent it. But at the same time, you want to be, you know, gathering data and grounding your further strategies in the data so you can be strategic, because, you know, the resources are limited on any campus, and so we want to, you know, you're going to need to prioritize and plan for a multi-year process.
And Elizabeth Shaler, I know that sometimes, you know, folks can start to feel a little overwhelmed if they've never done this type of work before, if they're brand new to it, if they're thinking, I don't really know that much about assessment, or, you know, I just don't know where to start with this. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your experience with the consortium, if there's any advice that you might lend to an institution that may be starting from scratch or maybe starting kind of new efforts around hazing, as to what might be helpful or things that you've learned along the way that you think might resonate with them.
I would say that, you know, in establishing a group that's going to focus on this, it's important to educate your group ongoing about what does hazing look like, and you know, participating in webinars so that people are feeling like they're continuing to be on the edge of what's going on. I would say certainly re-energizing folks in this work, it is ongoing, and so knowing that cultural change takes longer than you want it to, and so looking for those, you know, kind of small wins when things happen. You know, I think that it's on any campus you're going to be balancing lots of priorities, and so, you know, looking at this and saying there's other things that we might have to focus on in a given year, but we're going to keep working on, you know, this training project or this communication, and just being steadfast in terms of working on those things.
I loved what you said about really kind of honoring and paying attention to those small wins, because I also think what happens quite a bit when there's attention on any particular topic, whether it's this or another campus safety topic, a lot of times institutions will put a lot of effort in one place, and then when they're getting reports of things like hazing, or we see this quite a bit with campus sexual assault, they start to think, well, you know, what about all of these efforts? So something that may happen, I would imagine, as a result, is that when the campus is talking about this topic more, you may also find that more people are coming forward. So really looking for the small wins and really considering, you know, what might be the cause for some of the changes that we're seeing on the campus is going to be useful. We've had a couple of different questions come in, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But before we do that, we just wanted to present another resource. So as you're exploring what works for your campus, we're excited to share a free resource coming from the Clery Center and some really great partners. So the film We Don't Haze. And Elizabeth Allen and Stop Hazing worked with the Clery Center to create the 17-minute documentary-style film, and it really works to take a proactive approach to addressing hazing on campus. So in the film, we see individuals talking about how their lives are impacted by hazing. So there's a lot of stories from people who are directly impacted. But most importantly, I think you also hear from students that are talking about alternatives to hazing. So what I loved for what some of you put in the chat box is you were talking about, well, what about how do we present these alternatives? How do we figure out, you know, how to do team building and how people can bond without hazing? And that was really something that we were considering, especially when we were making this particular film. So it's meant to help the campus community better understand some of the nuances in talking about this hazing. You know, one of the things that was coming up quite a bit as both Elizabeth Allen and Elizabeth Schiller were talking is about how that concept of low-level hazing, or what people sometimes describe as low-level hazing, is not low level at all, because it creates that slippery slope. And so this is really meant to help the campus community better understand that and the many forms of hazing that we talked about earlier in the webinar. It's also intended to help drive them into action, so it recognizes those alternatives to hazing that accomplish the goals of team building and unity, and it's coming directly from students. So it's hearing from students on ways that they do it within their own student organizations. So it's meant to be used as a tool for prevention, and the companion documents, as you can see there, a discussion guide, an activity guide, and the companion brief for college and university professionals, which, as I mentioned, provides some really concrete strategies that you can use in terms of hazing prevention, and also gives you that list of who are some of the stakeholders to bring on board. That is just one piece in comprehensive approach to hazing prevention, which is what we've really been talking about. So I don't know if Elizabeth Allen, if you have kind of anything else that you would want to say about the project before we move on to some questions.
Well, I would just echo the things you said. It's been a very gratifying project and energizing and inspiring to see the students who got involved and shared their stories, and in terms of both their hazing experiences as well as those who are, you know, really clear about how to build group unity and team bonding without hazing.
So if you're interested in accessing that, as we've been going along, Amy has been plugging in some of the links to the consortium project and Stop Hazing, and they also just plugged in, she also just plugged in the link for We Don't Haze. So you'll be able to download the film directly and all of the guides directly, and then we're here as a resource and for support if you have questions about how to implement that on your campus. We're really excited to see all of the different ways that institutions are already using the film. So I'm going to move on to just some of the questions that have been coming in. So I'm going to start with Elizabeth Allen. If you could just share a little bit, one of the questions that people were asking is, if we're looking about, you know, you talked about assessment, how do you assess the climate related to hazing? We're hearing a lot about, you know, climate surveys in terms of campus sexual assault in particular, but what would it look like in terms of assessing the climate for hazing?
Well, you could implement a survey. We have a survey that you know, is specific to campus hazing, and measures the, you know, the types of hazing that are happening and where. But if if that's not, if that's not within the resources or within the budget, I would say, doing an environmental scan is an important place to start. And that includes things like, well, how many reports, official reports, are we getting? How many unofficial reports have professionals received about hazing? And really sort of digging in and asking questions of folks who work closely with students. And I would say also looking at the policies, looking at how often the policies are enforced or not enforced. All those kinds of things can give you a picture. We also recommend doing interviews with students and staff and other key stakeholders, and just not only asking them about hazing, but starting the conversation by asking them about the campus culture and what are the things that they think really are important aspects and unique aspects of their campus, and then talking about what are the experiences they've heard or they themselves have had joining clubs, organizations, or teams, and whether or not if they haven't had any hazing experiences, have they heard of any? So those are some key ways that you can gather information and work to assess the campus culture. And believe it or not, you can really learn a lot and in just making a concerted effort to talk with some key stakeholder groups.
Great, thank you. Great question coming in from participants or a participant related to the documentary, and they said the link to the documentary requires a password. Is it okay to link to the video and provide a password on our hazing webpage for institution so that students and staff could view this directly? So one of the things that we did is once you're able to access that video, you're also going to be able to download it. So once you go through, you can actually download the film itself. So if you want to put that on, for example, a campus website that's protected that only your campus community can access, you are more than welcome to share it in that way. We would just prefer you're not loading it into public websites like YouTube, because we want to try to get a sense of how people are using the film, because that really helps us as an organization better understand what campuses are doing and how this tool can be used. But certainly internally, once you've downloaded the film, you are more than welcome to put that on, for example, your private web page to have students and employees take a look at, and that's absolutely a way that we would love to see the film being used. Another question coming in is, we've been hearing a lot about hazing awareness and prevention, and do we think that hazing will eventually be added to Clery reporting policy and programming? I think it's an interesting concept because, certainly the Clery Act has been evolving quite a bit over the years, and I actually was just training at an institution, and somebody at the campus was saying how he's noticed that for a lot of the reports, not for a lot, but for some of the reports that he's seeing, the behaviors are actually hazing behaviors, and hazing is happening on the campus, but he felt like his annual security report really wasn't reflecting that. So he was actually talking to me about ways that he might go above and beyond and start to reflect those hazing statistics in a separate way so that the campus has a better sense of what's going on. So I've been really excited to see some campuses take a proactive approach to that, because we know, similarly to what we saw with domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, the most recent additions to the Clery Act, sometimes there are behaviors and crimes happening within the campus community, but the campus isn't made aware of them because, for example, it's an aggravated assault statistic but isn't labeled as hazing. So I think that it's certainly something that as we're seeing campuses evolve in the prevention work and the response work that we're doing, we're going to be seeing more of. And this is an opportunity when you're looking at what crime prevention programs do we have on our campus and security awareness programs. This is an avenue and a resource that you could be using for those purposes as well. So we are getting just to the end of our time together. A lot of different great questions came in today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for the webinar and to learn more, not just about this particular resource of We Don't Haze, but about all of the different things that a campus can do to address hazing. On the slide in front of you, you see contact information for the Clery Center for Security on campus. So if you have follow-up questions, if there were things that you wanted to ask but that you think of maybe later on in the day, please feel free to reach out to us. I want to thank you again, Elizabeth Allen, Elizabeth Shaler, and everyone that joined us for today's webinar. In your chat panel, you'll see a link to an evaluation for the webinar, and we'd really appreciate if you take just a few short minutes to share your thoughts and your feedback. We're always looking for what kind of content you'd like to see as we plan additional webinars throughout the year. And this webinar was just one of several for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So the webinar recording will be included in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email blast and will be available on the Clery Center's YouTube page. You can click on the links in the chat panel to register for those upcoming webinars and sign up to receive weekly professional development emails during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. We also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Clery Center handle and the hashtag of NACSAM 2015 for daily campus safety information. You can also visit our website to learn more about other training opportunities and learning resources, such as our Clery Center Collaborative Program, our team-based learning membership program that brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance. I know that Lehigh is a member, and we certainly appreciate that. And as part of National Campus Safety Awareness Month, we're providing a 10% discount on collaborative membership. So you are more than welcome to look at some of those resources. Reach out to us if you have any question about any of those. And the email that you see on the screen is a great way to contact us as you're moving forward, as you're creating change around hazing prevention and some of these other topics on your campus. We are always here to help support you throughout that process. So thank you to all of you for joining us here today, and we hope that you have a really wonderful afternoon.